Hey there, welcome to another video. In this one I'm going to talk about how to rig and animate a landing gear. This is the nose gear from a Voodoo F-101 fighter that I'm currently working on. So I thought I'd take a break from the project and talk about how I did the rigging. Alright, here we are in the Blender file, and right now all I've got is the various bits and pieces of this. So just geometry. There's no parenting, there's no armature or anything like that. Now, I like to start off by putting empties in key locations. So key locations being axles or points of rotation. So places like here, 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 here. Easy way to do that is to select an object, go into edit mode, and either select a ring of faces or a ring of an edge loop or something on both sides of the object like that. Shift S, cursor to selected, and it's going to put the cursor right there directly between those two pieces. And if we go back into object mode, I can say add, and I want to add an armature, I want to add a empty. I'm going to add a plane axis empty, and that sticks it right there. I would advise against hitting the S key in scaling, because that's going to change the scale of your empty, and that can sometimes affect transformations. I think it's better to go over here under the object data properties tab, and then just shrink this down just by grabbing this and making it something a little smaller so it doesn't stick out quite so far. Now I add a bunch of empties to various key locations, and maybe up here. Going to edit mode. In this case, I'm just going to shift select right through there and pick vertices on either side. Cursor selected, and I'm going to put an empty there. And I'm just going to do this, going to speed things up a bit and do that in a couple of other places. I'll be back in a second. All right, I put empties in key locations. Some of these empties will still exist at the end of the project and they'll be part of the actual rigging. Others are just temporary placeholders that is going to allow us to very precisely locate our bones. And there are going to be some more empties that I put in later on as we need them, but this will get us started. First thing I want to do is I want to select this one up here, put my cursor there, and I'm going to add a armature. So armature and a single bone. And I'm going to go into edit mode. Now I'm hitting tab to go into edit mode. If you do not see this pie menu, you can go into edit mode by going up here and then changing modes. But we're going to be doing a lot of bouncing back and forth between edit object and pose mode, and it'll really save you time if you have this pie menu enabled. And the way you do that, just in case you don't have it, is go up to edit, preferences, and then under the key map section, look for the tab for pie menu checkbox. And if you have that checked, then when you hit the tab key, you'll get these options. And this will save you a lot of time, because as this project goes on, you'll see that we're going back and forth between these modes a lot. So I'm going to take the top of this bone. I'm just going to move it straight down on the Z-axis, and let's move this bone straight up. And I'm just going to rotate it 90 degrees just to get it out of the way. And this is going to be the root bone for all other things in this rig. So everything below this is going to be either a direct child or an indirect child of this bone. So while I'm in edit mode, I'm going to hit F2 and I'm going to call this bone root. And I'm going to go over here. He's a little funny guy running here. There's object data properties. I want to turn on names so we can see what the names are, because we're going to have a lot of bones. It's easy to see them. And I'm going to add another bone here. I'm going to call this one, I just hit Shift A to add another bone. And I'm going to take the tip of this bone, I'm just going to move it down here for a second. And let's call this one Control. And this bone's actually going to control the entire rig. This bone here is going to move, you can, by grabbing this bone eventually, you'll be able to move the entire rig, but this bone here is the one that's going to be used to animate the entire rig. Another thing I want to do is I want to click on this in front option. You can see how that makes the bone always show up regardless of what geometry is in front of it. And that'll be helpful in seeing what's going on. So let's go back to object mode. I'm going to choose this empty here, cursor to select it, so I'm going to put it right there. Go back into edit mode, choose the tip of this bone, and then choose selection to cursor, and that's going to precisely locate my control bone, which is the whole reason for putting these empties in, because we're going to be bouncing back between these things over and over, and it's nice to have a known point in space. Now if we go into pose mode and we move the root bone, nothing happens. We move the control bone, nothing happens. And that's because we haven't told Blender any kind of relationship between the bones or the geometry. So let's start off by going into edit mode, and I'm going to choose this control bone, shift select the root bone, hit Control P, and you have two options. You can either do connected or offset. If you click connected, Blender's going to try to create a chain out of the bones. And that's not what we want, so I'm going to undo that with Control Z. I'm going to hit Control P again, and now I'm going to choose this keep offset. And now these bones are parented, so if I go into pose mode, if I choose the root, you can see that that control bone moves with it. But the control bone, because it's a child, can move independently of the root. All right, so let's rig this strut here. We have these two pieces of the strut with the upper and lower oleo struts, and this is a piston rig, so this would move up and down inside of here. So how do we do that? I'm going to choose this empty that's down here right in the middle of my axis. I'm going to say cursor to selected, so I got my cursor right there. Go back, choose the bones, tab, go into edit mode, and I'm going to add a bone. You can see it puts the bone right there where I got my axis. I'm going to move this straight down. All right, and this bone down here is going to serve two purposes. It's going to control the piston motion of this lower strut, and it's also going to act as a sensor to tell where the wheel is interacting with the floor. So I have already in my scene, sorry, get rid of all this stuff. I have a ground plane set up, which is just a cube that I'm going to use as the floor of the ground, and we don't want the wheel to ever penetrate that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into edit mode, and let me just temporarily change this to stick so we can see a little better. You can see the tip of the bone right there. With that bone selected, I'm going to hit G, Z, and I'm going to move it straight down until the tip of that bone is just about on the ground. And I want the wheel to penetrate a little bit because I want it to look like it's flattening under weight. But I don't want it to go too far through the floor, and I certainly don't want it to float above the floor or be completely rounded, because plane's heavy, it's going to deform that tire. So let's go back to octahedral, and you can see where my bone is. Let's call this lower strut. It'll be a lower strut bone, and I'm going to duplicate that. I'm going to move it straight up. I'm going to click the tip. I'm going to go G, Z, and I'm going to move it down. GY, or Z rather. And we're going to call this one, hit F2, I'm going to call this upper strut. Normally you would rig a piston with the bones directly inside the two halves of the piston, but because there's a caster angle on this tire, and because I want this sensor to be directly underneath the middle of the tire, I'm rigging this piston kind of outside and behind these objects. It'll work fine. We'll do a regular piston setup up here, but right now that's why I've got them displaced behind the cylinders, because I'm doing a dual purpose with this guy. Now right now there are no relationships between any of these bones, so if I go into pose mode and I move my control bone, nothing happens. So we need to tell Blender how these things relate to each other. So going into edit mode again, I'm going to click my lower strut, my upper strut, and finally shifting select my control bone, hit Control P, and keep offset. Now if we go back into pose mode, those bones all move together. Let's connect some geometry to this. So I'm going to select the two tires, the lower oleo, shift select the armature, go into pose mode, and then I'm going to choose this lower bone, hit Control P, and we get a different menu this time, and I want to choose bone. And that's going to parent these three pieces of geometry to this bone. So if I move this bone now, those things all tie in together. And I'm going to do something similar on the top. I'm going to choose the upper strut, shift select the armature, go into pose mode, make sure I've got the upper strut bone selected, Control P, and choose bone. And now if I move the upper bone, the upper strut moves. And more importantly, if I move the control bone, the landing gear moves with it. Now we want to limit the rotation of this control bone because we don't want the landing gear moving all over the place like that, right? We want to only have it run along this axis. And if we have this bone selected, we have the control bone selected, and we go down here and we look at this axis checkbox, you can see that each of these bones has their own axes. So we can see we've got an x-axis, we've got the z-axis coming out here on the side. A little hard to there is better. And then, of course, the y would be running down there. So we only want this bone to rotate along its z-axis. So with the control bone selected, I can go over here and we'll get out of, we'll go into Euler there. And I can just lock these two. And then you can see that if I move along the z-axis, that strut moves just the way we want it to move. And then, if I'm in just hitting the R key to move things, it's locked into place, and we don't have to worry about it moving out of orientation. So that's good. Now let me bring up my image plane. I have an image plane here that shows the down, fully down position, as well as the fully retracted position for the landing gear. And as I put the rigs together, I like to test each piece as I put it in, just to make sure that things are working, as opposed to putting all the bones in and then trying to figure out, debugging it. I think it's kind of hard to do. So with the gear in its fully down position, I'm going to select this control bone. I'm in pose mode, and this is like the default position here. So I want to go over here, and I want to right click on the Z, and I want to insert a single keyframe. So now this is the position at frame 1, and I've got 120 frames on animation. So I'm going to go to the very end of my animation. With that control bone selected, I'm going to rotate. I'm going to rotate my my landing gear up, and I'm going to get it kind of lined up as best I can with the background image. And it's not super important that it's perfect here. Getting close is good enough. We'll adjust it later as we get more of the linkage tied in. But basically that's where it's going to go at the end of the animation, and I'm going to now insert a single keyframe there as well. And if we go back to our beginning frame, you can now scrub through the timeline and everything moves nicely. So the nice thing about creating this animation early on is, or at least creating these keyframes, is you can test the rig both in object mode and in pose mode. So it saves you a little bit of time, right? So you can do both. So that's kind of nice. All right, what's next? Let's define the actual piston, because we haven't done that yet. Let me get rid of the ground for a moment. Because right now, if I move this bone, it doesn't actually stay inside that strut. So how do we do that? We create a piston rig using a damped track constraint. Now with working bones, you need to be careful that you choose the right constraints. If you go over here, you can see that there is an object constraint properties, and it has things like floor and child of and damp track. And there's also a bone constraint property, which also has things like floor and child of and damped track. If you use the object constraint to rig your bones, it is not going to work properly. You want to make sure you're in the bone constraint. And here I want to choose the damped track constraint. I'm going to use the eyedropper to select the armature. You know what? This is probably a good time. Let's go back to object mode. I'm going to rename my armature. I'm going to hit F2. I'm going to call this nose gear armature. All right, that's better, because we're going to have a lot of pieces. It's good to have good names here. So back into pose mode. Sorry about that. So we're in pose mode. We've got the nose gear armature selected as the target. And for the bone, we want to choose from a list. And this is why it's good to name all your bones, because it's easy to pick upper strut from this. And now while I'm in pose mode, if I move this bone, you can see how it tries to point toward that upper bone. And we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to create a damped track constraint, choose the armature, and this time we're going to choose the lower strut. And now if we move them, it starts to act like a piston, right? And again, good thing to test. Everything still flows nicely. That's all good. Now if you ever go back in your timeline, you see how this bone is now out of whack here. Two options here. You can either hit the jump to endpoint button again, and that'll snap it back into position, or you can hit the Alt-R key, and that should fix it as well. Now if you notice, or you may not have noticed, this strut extends 9 inches. See, there's a 9 inches here. When the strut is in the up position, the landing gear actually extends way out here. So what I want to do is I want to move this along its y-axis out to here, and that's going to define the kind of the outer limit of the strut's movement. And you can see when I move this, it's changing this value here along the Y. So I want to keyframe this. I'm going to insert a single keyframe so that at frame 120, the lower strut is extended this distance. And now if we go back to the beginning, you can see that the strut is now too far down because it actually penetrates way into the ground, and we don't want that. And the way we fix that is we add a floor constraint. And the floor constraints over here, we've got the lower strut bone selected still. We're going to go to floor, add floor. And for the target, we're going to use the ground. And you can see how that just snaps it right up. And the settings we have here are just fine. So now if we go into side view and we play our animation, you can see how the wheel then just rides right across the ground as it extends. It just doesn't go past that point, which is what we want. All right. Another thing we want to do is if we look at, we've defined the maximum extension range of the lower oleo strut, but we haven't defined a minimum range. So if I, for example, collect this this bone up here, the control bone, and bring it down, you can see how if I bring it straight down, it compresses past the point where it should. So we can add limit distance constraints to this rig to make sure that never happens as well. So starting with the control bone, I'm going to add a limit distance, which is right here. I'm going to choose the lower strut bone as the target for that. And you notice that Blender puts in a value here under distance, and it's nice enough to calculate the current distance between these two bones, which is where that value comes from, so we don't have to change that value. And then you see there's a drop-down box here that says inside, outside, and on surface. The way this is calculated is there's an imaginary sphere that's drawn around the bone, and these values or settings define where on that sphere that distance is calculated. So inside means that these bones are allowed to travel inside that sphere and basically creating like an outer limit. Those bones can't go outside the sphere with their distance. The outside option means that these bones must remain outside that sphere. They can never penetrate the surface, so it kind of creates a minimum distance between the two. And then the final one is on the surface, and that's where these bones have to ride along the surface and kind of fixes the distance based on the radius of that sphere. In our case, we want to use the outside because we want this bone to be able to go up. So if I hit G, it goes up. But now if I'm trying to push the bone down, you can see how that it's limiting it so that I can't overcrush that strut. And I'm also going to add the same constraint here on the upper strut. I don't need this one. And do the same kind of thing where I'm going to choose the lower strut. See that it's calculated distance for us here, and we're going to choose outside as well for that. So that if I move this bone, I'm trying to push it down and I can't get it any closer. So that gives us kind of our minimum and maximum distances there. All right, let's move on to these forward stay pieces. You can see how they kind of bend up like this when they go into the retracted mode. And you can imagine this as kind of like a hip, a knee, and an ankle joint. So there's the hip, the knee, and the ankle. Oops. Go in the side view. And they're going to kind of bend up this way. So this joint here eventually ends up there. So let's create another bone. So I'm going to move my cursor up to this point. Like I said, consider this like the hip. And if we go into, we select our, turn that off, I don't need the axes anymore. We go into edit mode, and I'm going to put my cursor, and my cursor's already there, so hit Shift A, and I can just, I don't want to scale it, I just want to move this tip down here. There we go. All right, and I'm going to create, put the cursor there. And with the cursor there, I'm going to say Shift S, selection to cursor, and that lets me, precisely put the tip of that bone there. And that'll be kind of like our knee or our elbow. I'm going to hit E to extrude that bone out. And I'm going to select this empty here that I've got in the middle of the next joint. Cursor to selected there. Go back into edit mode, selection to cursor. That's going to snap it precisely there. And now I'm going to add another bone. I'm not going to hit E. I don't want to extrude. I want to hit A to add a bone. I'm sorry, I want to hit Shift A to add a bone. There you go. That works better. And this is going to be our IK handle. I'm just going to take that down. I'm going to move it down here. I'm sorry, I accidentally hit a button there. And I'm just going to make it smaller. Okay, so let's call this stay IK. This will be stay lower, and this will be stay upper. All right, so we got our bones named, and if we go into pose mode, and I rotate this bone, it moves the lower bone properly. That's right, and then this is like the lower leg. That's fine. And you notice that the IK bone is not actually attached to anything, and that's the way it should be at this point. So we want this whole thing, this chain of bones, to be parented to the root. So if we move the root bone, you can see it moves the other bones, but there's no definition yet between this chain and this. So if we go into edit mode, we select the upper stay, shift select the root, Control P, and choose the keep offset. And now if we go into pose mode and move stuff, those bones all follow each other properly. Next thing to do is define an IK handle or an IK rig for these three bones so that Blender can do all the calculating for us. The easy way to do that is to select the IK handle first. This is in pose mode, by the way. Shift select the first bone in the chain, and then hit Shift I or Shift India, and then choose the 2 active bone option. And you'll notice let me do it over here. You can see there's no constraints on these bones yet, so I hit Shift I, and then you can see that it creates an IK constraint for us, which is cool. The only thing we need to do right away is you notice that the chain length is 0, and we have 2 bones in here, and you want to set that to 2 because we got 2 bones. And then if we move the IK handle, you can see that these bones all work together based on the position of this IK bone. Now, obviously, there's no relationship yet here with the main strut, so the next thing to do is to somehow tie this IK bone to the strut. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to hide the armature for a second, and you can see that I've got, let me get that out of the way too. You can see I've got a little crosshair empty that's set right at this axis, and I want to select that, shift select it, Control P, and this time I'm just going to select, I'm parenting to an object, so I'm going to choose object. And let me turn back all my armature. Go to pose mode because I'm wonky there. All right. So now you can see that if I move the upper arm, that empty comes with it, right? That's what we want. So now we're going to go back into pose mode, select our IK bone, go into constraints, and now I'm going to choose a child of constraint that's going to let us basically pin this bone to this empty. So now I can just choose that bone choose that empty. Wrong word. And now if we scrub through our animation, see how those bones now start to collapse because we've basically pinned this position up here to be parented to the root, and then we pinned this IK bone so that it must follow this empty as it goes through the animation. So let's I'm going to go to stick mode for a bit because it's getting a little overwhelming. Stick mode, and I'm going to parent our geometry to these bones. So select the stay, shift select the armature, go into edit mode, go into pose mode, choose the bone, Control P, parent it to the bone, go back into object mode, choose the lower stay, shift select the armature, go into pose mode. Now I choose the lower bone, Control P, and choose bone. And now, as always, we want to test to see how things look. So I'm going to scrub it, and we can see that our bones follow nicely until they get up here. And look what happens. So what's happening is at some point the IK solution starts to fail because it extends too far. So it works up to a point, and then it doesn't. So in order to fix that, what we need to do is we need to create something that's called a pull target. And I'm going to go back into object mode here, and I'm going to put my cursor right here on this kind of elbow joint. Maybe I'll go back to sticks so we can see a little better. So I've got my cursor set up here at this elbow joint, and what we need to do is, if you notice in the, if I select this bone in pose mode and go to the constraints, you can see there's a pull object target of the IK constraint. And what that does is it helps Blender determine which direction it wants to make this joint bend in. It's just a little bit of extra helper information. So what we're going to do is, with the cursor there, I'm going to edit mode, and I'm going to add another bone. So I hit Shift A to add a bone. And I'm just going to bring this way down here and just kind of point it there, and I'm going to move it out there-ish. And let's call this stay pull. All right, so this is going to be the pull bone for this rig here. And if we go back down here, choose that bone, and now we can choose the pull target, which is going to be, choose the armature, and then we can use stay pull. I don't know if you noticed, but when I did that, it flipped the direction of this lower stay pull. And that's because the pull angle is set to 0. I'm going to change that back to 180, and then that puts it back in the right direction. So let's see what happens when we scrub through our animation now. So in pose mode, it still flips up. And that's because this pull bone is not really part of the solution here, and we need to make sure that this pull bone always stays ahead of this joint. So go back into edit mode. I'm just going to move a little bit further up so we can see what's going on. And so a solution for this would be to parent this bone to something so that it always rotates up. So I'm going to, with this bone selected, and I'm in edit mode, shift select on the control bone, control P, keep offset, and now if we go into pose mode and I scrub through, you can see how this bone starts to rotate up as things work, and we don't get that horrible motion there at the end. So that seems to work pretty well, keeping that bone at a good angle so that the IK solution knows what to do with that joint. So let's turn back on the image plane. Let's go back to our end position, and I don't know if you remember, oops, sorry about that. I don't remember earlier on I said that we probably have to adjust things, adjust this angle to make everything quite fit. And you can see how these stay bones here, or these upper and lower stays, aren't quite folding in far enough. So with the control bone selected, I'm going to hit R. I'm just going to rotate that up just a little bit more, just to get these angles to fit a little better. And then I'm going to overwrite this by replacing a single keyframe. And that'll make me feel a little better as far as the final, the final position of everything. But just doing a quick test here, everything looks like it's collapsing nicely. All right, excellent. All right, let's move on to this locking arm that's here in the middle. This this bit here folds when it's landing gear's down, it's straight across and it locks these two pieces, and then when it's in the up position, it's also straight across and it locks everything. But when it's transitioning, it folds in half, kind of like scissors, and is bent when everything's going up. So let's start by putting the cursor here, and I'm going to create a set of bones for here. We're going to use an IK rig here as well. So I'm going to hit Shift A to add a bone, object mode, cursor to selected. Go back into edit mode, selection to cursor, and this time I'm going to hit E to extrude. Put my cursor here. Selection, oops, just the tip, that's all I want. Selection to cursor, and while the cursor is here, I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to add another bone. And this is going to be the IK handle for this locking mechanism. So let's just kind of put that there, and let's name stuff. Let's call this lock IK, call this lock 2, and we'll call this lock 1. And we need to create a IK chain for this, so shift select the two pieces. Oh, we need to be in pose mode, sorry. Select one, select the other, Shift I creates our IK rig here. We will have 2 bones. We need to set 2 bones. 1 and 2. There we go. And if we move our handle, things should bend nicely. Now we're going to have a problem because this is pretty much a straight line, and Blender really wants, triangles when solving IK handles. So we're going to need a pole target in here eventually. But in the meantime, let's go to edit mode, and I'm going to parent this to the control bone, Control P, keep offset, and we're going to do something similar that we did with the stays. We're going to use an empty to control where the IK handle is. So I've selected this empty that I've got here at this joint. I'm going to shift select the upper stay, Control P, and I'm going to parent to object. So now if I move the upper stay, that empty goes with it. And then I can go into pose mode, select my IK handle, and add a child of constraint, and choose that empty. All right, let's see what happens now. And we can see that it's collapsing, but it's collapsing in the wrong direction, right? We knew that was going to happen because there is no pole target. So let's go back and connect these guys. So I've selected one of my locks, shift selected the armature, go into pose mode, make sure I've got this bone selected, Control P, bone, and go back out, select this lock, shift select the armature, pose mode, choose this bone, Control P, bone. And now these two pieces of the landing gear are attached to these bones, so if we scrub, they should move. All right, they're moving badly, but they're moving. And what we want to do is, if you think about it, this joint here kind of goes in a circular motion. And sometimes to visualize things, I like to kind of put in some things to help me see them. So in this case, I'm going to create a circle, and I'm going to scale it down so that it's centered on this piece there. And I'm just going to scale it so that it's going through this joint, just to imagine what's going on here. So as the upper gear or upper strut rotates, this joint here, we want it to kind of follow this arc. So we want our pole target to follow that arc as well. Actually, I'm going to put my cursor right there. Go into edit mode. I'm going to add a bone. And I'm going to move it, I'm going to shrink it down. It's too big. GZ. Oop. And I'm going to move it forward on the y-axis, so it puts it right on this circle. And I'm just going to move this back here so that the bone is on that arc. And I'm going to rotate the bone to be roughly up here. So with my 3D cursor set here, and I'm in 3D cursor mode, I'm going to rotate this bone until it's, maybe up there. And then I'm going to shift select on the control, and I'm going to Control P, and I'm going to parent the pole bone for this joint to the control bone. So let's rename this, and we'll call this lock pole. And go back to pose mode, and we go back to the first bone in the IK chain, and we want to add a pole target, which is going to be the armature, and then we want to choose the lock pole as the target, as the pole target for it. And in pose mode, let's see what happens now. See that as it goes up, this pole lock, this lock pole is making sure that this bone joint is always pointing in the right direction. And then hopefully when it goes all the way to the end here, it snaps straight across. So it seems to have worked. Just run it one more time just to double check. Yep, looking good. All right. So what's next? Why don't we rig this piston next here? So for that, we're going to need an extra empty. So I'm going to go back into object mode, and I'm going to select this ball joint down here. I'm going to put my cursor there, cursor 2 selected, and go back into object mode. And I'm going to take one of these other empties, I'm going to duplicate it, and Shift S, selection of cursor. So that's put my empty right there in the middle of that joint. And let's hide this for a moment. And I'm going to add another empty here, cursor there. And like I said before, some of these empties are going to exist at the very end, and some of these are just here just to make life a little A little easier when I'm selecting and positioning things. And let's put another one right up here at the top of the piston. So duplicate that and put it up there. All right, so this is going to be more of a traditional piston rig, but it's going to use some of the same ideas that we used to create the oleo struts. So with our cursor, let's put our cursor right there and go back into the armature, go into edit mode. I'm going to add a bone. I'm just going to bring this down here so we can see it. And I'm going to put my cursor here and Shift S, selection to cursor, and now my bone is perfectly aligned inside the lower half of that piston. You can see that the pointy end is pointing that way. And let's call this bone piston lower. All right, and we're going to create another bone up here at the top, so we can just duplicate this bone. And we want this bone to point in the other direction, so I'm going to take this end, and let's put the cursor up here. Check this bone, selection to cursor, and then we're going to take the, oops, here we go. Put the cursor down here, cursor selected, edit mode, and selection to cursor. And if we turn this back on, you can see that they're pointing towards each other. All right, looks good. And we want to do the damped constraint, right? Remember that constraint we had on the bones? Use a damp constraint, and let's rename this while we're here too. So F2 piston upper. All right, that'll make things easier. So we're going to add a damped constraint. We're going to choose the armature. Now we're going to choose the piston lower as the target. And for this one, we're going to do the similar thing, damped track constraint, choose the armature, and this time we're going to choose the piston upper as the target. So if we move this guy, you can see that they're pinned together. They're always pointing towards each other, which is what we want. But now we need to create the relationship between these pistons and the rest of the armature, because we haven't defined that yet. So we want the end of this piston to always ride on this empty. So let's go back into object mode. We're going to select the empty. We're going to select the geometry that it's attached to, Control P, so that it's parented to that. So now if we scrub, that empty should go along with it. And now we want to go into edit mode, choose this bone, and we're going to add, go into pose mode, and we're going to add a child of constraint, and we're going to choose that empty. So now hopefully when things move, that bone now moves with that structure, which is what we want. And we want this bone here to actually be a parent of the root, right? Because you figured this and this are all attached to the airframe, so they would all move together. So in edit mode, I selected the upper piston, I select the root, I Control P, and I keep offset. Go back into pose mode. And you can see that it's not working the way you would think it would work. And that's because the order of operations actually makes a difference. We've got the track above the child of, but if I switch these two, now it starts to look better, right? Now as the piston goes up and down, it's staying attached here, and it's riding along the track. So if you get odd behavior, sometimes order of operations makes a difference. So let's select the upper piston and shift select the armature. Nope, upper piston, armature, pose mode, choose this bone, Control P, bone, and do something down here. We're going to select the geometry, shift select the armature, Control P, bone, and let's do a quick test. And the piston looks like it's going up okay. Just let it run. All right, that's looking good as well. Awesome. So we've got our piston, We got our stays, we got our locks. Oops. Was out of line a little bit. All right, let's see, what else can we do here? We need to work on this. This is a shimmy damper / steering unit back here. So let's talk about that next. So back here we have another kind of triangle. So probably thinking IK rig again, right? In this case, we're going to have the hip joint here, the knee joint here, and the foot joint down there. So let's select, or let's put our cursor right here on this axle. And I'm going to select our armature. Hit tab, go into edit mode, and I'm going to create a bone. I'm just going to bring the tip down so we can see it. Back to object mode. Cursor is selected. It doesn't look like it's really in the middle there, does it? Let me try different. I think I didn't put that right in the middle, so let's put the cursor there. Selection the cursor, and then just move it to the center line. That looks better. All right, so cursor is selected, and let's see, take our bone, selection to cursor, and I'm going to hit E to extrude that out. Choose the empty that's in the middle here, put my cursor there, go back into edit mode, selection to cursor, and then I'm going to add an IK handle. So Shift A to add a bone. We don't want to extrude, we want to add. I'm going to move this down here. This will be, you can imagine this is kind of like the foot of the shimmy damper rig. So let's rename this. Call this damper IK. This damper lower and damper upper. All right, so we've got our, the start of our IK rig again. Let's go into pose mode, select our IK handle, shift select the first bone, shift I, create our constraint. Now in this case, we're probably not going to need an IK or a pull target because the joint is already well defined and the angle here is obvious. Blender doesn't have to guess. We don't have a straight line. But we do need to set our chain length. We have 2 bones. And if we grab this bone, stuff should move. So let's parent some things here. I'm not going to actually rig these pistons. This would be for the steering mechanism. I'm not going to do that. But I do want all this stuff here to be parented to this upper bone. So I've shift selected all those items. Finally, shift selecting on the armature, going into pose mode, choosing the upper bone there, Control P, choosing bone. I'm going back out, and I'm going to choose the lower scissor here, shift select the armature, go into pose mode, choose this bottom bone, Control P, choose the bone. Let's see what that does if I move things. All right, so far so good. Don't worry about these cables, we'll do those later. That looks good. All right, so now we just need to connect the ends of this bone chain to the rest of the rig. So what we can do is we can take this empty here, and we're going to parent it to the upper strut. Control P, object. I'm going to choose this bone. I'm going to pose mode, and I'm going to add a child of constraint, and I'm going to choose that empty. So now if I move this empty, I move that whole thing, and since this is parented to the upper strut, all that stuff moves together now. And then we're just going to do something similar down here. I'm going to take this empty, shift select the lower strut, and let me make sure everything's lined up here, because I don't know if that would make a difference. All right, so go back to object mode, select the empty, shift select the lower strut, Control P. So now this is part of the lower oleo, and then for the IK handle, let's go into pose mode, and we want this this damper handle, this damper IK handle, to be parented, or a child of rather, that empty. So I'm just going to choose that empty, and with any luck, when we scrub through here, we can see that as our landing gear extends, this scissor thing back here functions properly and follows along with it. Awesome. I'm going to hit Alt-R just to reset everything. All right, let's talk about these springs here. They will need to stretch and move with the armature. So let's isolate some stuff here. I'm going to take the bit there, that bit, and I'm going to add a couple more empties here. Cursor to selected. I'm going to add an empty. It's not the empty I want. Add an empty, and let's scale it down. And I'm going to duplicate it. Right click to cancel my movement, and then I'm going to move it across to the other side. And let's duplicate that. And let's do something similar here. Cursor selected. Selection to cursor, so that's going to put it right in the middle of that. And duplicate it. Oops. Duplicate it, right click to move, cancel the movement, and then move it over to the other side. So we want these two empties to be parented to the upper strut. So shift selecting them all, Control P, object. And then we want these two empties to be parented to this piece here. So shift select that, Control P. Now if I move this, those empties go with it. And the same thing down here. All right. So far so good. I don't think I need my image plane right now. So now we need to put some bones in here and then add some stretching constraints. So let's put the cursor back up here and go into edit mode. I'm going to add a bone. Move it down here just so we can see it. Go back into object mode, select our empty, cursor to selected, edit mode, take the tip, selection of cursor. Now that bone is precisely located there, and we're going to do the same thing over here. Select the empty, cursor to selected, go back to the armature, edit mode, add a bone. There we go. Move this down. Choose this empty here, cursor to selected, go back to the bones, edit, make sure I just got the tip selected, selection of cursor. All right, that was a lot of work. All right, so now we have the two bones running through our springs. Now we just need to create the relationships between them. So going into pose mode, into edit mode, I want to select this bone, the spring bones, and I want these bones to follow this piece of geometry. So I'm going to shift select this lock bone, Control P, choose keep offset, and if we go into either pose or object mode, so you can see now that these bones are following along with that. That's what we want, but we obviously want them to stay attached down here. So what we can do is we can go into pose mode and we can add a stretch to constraint. So go down to our bone constraints and we want to choose the stretch to, and we're going to choose this empty here. And if we test it, we can select that empty, and if we move it, then that bone moves with it. All right, and we want to do the same thing on this side. Choose the armature, pose mode, choose the bone, add a stretch to constraint, choose the empty, just give it a test. That looks good. And if we move the strut, then those bones should also stretch. You can see how they're stretching there. All right, and the last thing I think we need to do here is we need to now connect the springs to these bones. So I've selected the spring, shift select the armature, go to pose mode, select this bone, and I'm going to hit Control P, and we're going to parent to the bone. And I'm going to do the same thing over here, select the spring, shift select the armature, go into pose mode, choose this bone this time, Control P, and select the bone. And you know what I'm going to actually take a moment and name this. We're going to F2. We're going to call this spring dot L. and we'll call this, except that was spring.r. It's the right side of the plane. Spring.r and spring.l. All right. Now, hopefully, when we scrub through here, you can see how those springs stretch. All right, that's looking good. We've got a couple of things just kind of floating back here. These are hard lines, hard hydraulic lines. You can see they don't follow it along at all. So I'm just going to take these, shift select the upper, and just parented, simple parenting. That'll bring those along. We have another smaller spring here, and this is exactly the same thing that we just did with these springs. So go into the right side here, and we're going to put a couple empties in here. So edit mode, I'm going to select maybe this loop here, cursor is selected, place an empty, scale it down, duplicate the empty, and do something similar down here. I'm just going to select an edge loop, cursor is selected, and take this empty and put it there. Now we just need to create a bone that runs up through there. So with our cursor still there, let's go into our object mode, select the armature, go into edit mode, and we're going to say add to add a bone. And let's take the tip of that and drag it down. Select our empty, cursor selected, select our bone, make sure we got the tip selected, and then put it right there. All right, so now we just need to have this bone follow along with the rig. So in edit mode, I want this bone to be parented to the scissor strut. So shift select, control P, and that way if we go into pose mode, if I move this bone here, those things are connected, and I want it to be pinned at the top here to this. So I'm going to, in object mode, select our empty, shift select the upper strut, control P, so now this empty here, make it a little bigger, is connected to the upper strut. So when the upper strut moves, that empty moves with it. And now in pose mode, we can add a stretch to constraint. And choose this empty as the target. And while I'm in here, let's change that. I'll call this small spring. And hopefully if we scrub through here, everything stays connected. So that's good. So the only thing we need then to do with this spring is to select the spring, shift select the armature, go to pose mode, make sure that small spring bone is selected, control P, and choose bone. And then let's take a look, give it a test. Everything stays connected. There's not a lot of stretch to that spring, but you can see as this axle moves down, it does in fact deform a little bit. All right, so let's talk about these hydraulic lines in the back. Now, these are not geometry. They're not like hard geometry. They're actually Bezier curves. So you can see that I've got 2 points, one at each end, and I made them curved so that they're flexible. And we're going to use that flexibility to our advantage. So let's select our upper and our piece there, and we're going to add a couple more empties here. Let's go to edit mode, and I'm going to choose that edge loop, cursor to selected, and I'm going to add an empty, and make it much smaller, something like that, maybe a little bigger. There you go. And shift D, right click to cancel the movement, and then just move it across the x-axis so it's over there. And I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to do something similar here. Going to edit mode, cursor selected, selection to cursor, and then I can just duplicate this and move it across the x-axis as well. So now I've got empties on both of these AN fittings here. So these two up here, I want to shift select them, shift select the upper arm, Control P, parent them to the object so that they move with that. And we're going to do something similar down here. We're going to shift select these two, shift select the top of the shimmy damper, Control P, and parent them there so that when the shimmy damper moves, those move as well. All right, so now we're going to use a slightly different way of connecting things. So I'm going to select my Bezier curve, shift select my empty. So I'm going to select my empty first, shift select the Bezier curve, go into edit mode, and then I'm going to see how I selected the top point here on the curve. And if I do Control H as in hotel, I have three options: hook to new object, selected object, or to selected object bone. I'm going to choose the hook to selected object. So it's going to hook this vertex to the empty that I originally selected there. So let's do that over here as well. So I'm going to shift select, go in and Control H for hook and select object. And to show you what happens here, now that that's hooked, if I move this empty, that Bezier curve moves with that empty, and we need to do the same thing down here at the bottom. So choose the empty, shift select on the curve, go into edit mode. Now we need to select this point, Control H to hook, selected object, and again on this side, shift select, tab edit mode, choose this bottom point, Control H, hook, and then just to test it, yep, that works. That works. And now when we scrub through this, these hydraulic lines should then stretch and stay attached to those AN fittings. So looking good so far. Let's choose the armature and just repose everything. And maybe just do one test just to see how everything looks. Pretty happy with that. You notice some of these empties aren't moving. These are the empties that I said are going to be expendable at the end of the project, and they can be cleaned up later. But for right now, everything's looking good. Take a moment to save that. All right, at this point, we have a rig that we can control with our timeline, but it'd be much more convenient if we could control it with some other device, because right now this thing only runs between frame 1 and 120. If we're doing an animation, it might be nice to raise the gear up at some point, and then later on raise it down, and so having it here is limited value. So what we need to do is we need to create an action, and we need to use create like a widget or a controller that we can then use to then manipulate the landing gear. So in object mode, I'm going to create a circle. I'm going to change it to 7, and I'm just going to shrink that down. Go into edit mode. I'm going to grab these, shrink them down, shrink these in, and make an arrow, and select everything, Shift D, rotate it 180 degrees, bring it straight down, maybe shrink everything down a bit, a little bit smaller. Object mode, right click, set origin to geometry, apply rotation and scale so everything's zeroed out, and maybe we'll just make this -1 meters down on the z-axis, and let's call this nose gear up down. And over here we can turn on the name so we can see what it looks like, and we're going to use this to control the movement of the landing gear as opposed to using the timeline directly. So the way you do that is with action constraint. So let me bring this down a bit. I'm going to bring up another window, and we're going to go to the dope sheet, and under dope sheet you want to go to action editor, and you can see, let me bring this down a little bit more. If I click on our skeleton here, this controller has a timeline on it. This control bone has the keyframes on it, and there's an action item that goes with it. You can see the keyframes here up here inside the action. So I'm going to rename this action. I'm going to call this gear nose gear up down. That'll be the name of this action, and I want to create an empty user for it. The reason you want to create an empty user for it is we're going to actually delete this action from the nose gear, and by default, if when you close Blender, if it sees that the action's not associated with any objects, it'll delete it as part of the cleanup process when you're closing the file. So we don't want to ever lose it. We want to make sure that it's always available, and then we're just going to delete it from this this bone here. But it still exists. We didn't actually delete it from the file. It is still there. All right, next thing we want to do is we want to add a action constraint to this bone. So if we go over here to our bone constraints, right? Remember, this is a bone constraint. We want to go over here and we're going to look for action. The target of the action is going to be our widget, this guy, right? And that movement of this is going to activate this action. We don't need a vertex group. This is fine. We want to use the Z location, so the vertical location of our widget, so Z location, and we want to use the local space. If you used world space, then anytime this thing moved in world space, like if it was attached to the aircraft, then the gear would be affected. It would go up and down. So you only want it in local space. The min range, we're going to say -1 to maybe -0.5 for the max. And we want to choose the action, which is that nose gear up down that we deleted up there a moment ago. And we want to go from frame 1 to 120, which is how long our animation ran. Now if I go back into object mode, if I move this up and down, then the landing gear moves with it. And we can animate and keyframe this as opposed to having to run the animation. So now what happens if I run the animation? Nothing happens. And that's because we've removed the timeline from the landing gear, and now we can add that any kind of keyframes we want to this. Now we do want to add some constraints to this object because we don't want it to be able to move infinitely in up and down direction. So what we can do here is we can add a actual object constraint. So over to object constraints, and we want to add a limit location, which would be this guy here. And for this, we're going to check all these boxes. And it's going to look horrible for a second. I'm going to change this to -5.79, -1, and -5.79, and -0.5. All right, and that's just going to limit the distance this can travel vertically. And you want to also click on this effect transform. Without this, if I move this up and down, you're going to watch over here in the location channel. You can see that as I move it up, it just keeps, I'm scrolling my mouse up. You can see those values keep going up. If I click on the effect transformation checkbox, and now when I go up the Z key, you can see that it just stops. I'm trying to move up even forward, but that Z location is just not it's not translating up. It's locking the value at these. And then we also want to change this to local space. And then now we can control this motion with this widget. And then if we wanted to, we can then animate this with its own keyframe. So let's say we wanted to have a full cycle here. So let's go to 240. And let's say we're only using on the Z-axis. So I'm going to right-click on here. I'm going to add a single keyframe. And at the end of the animation, and I can keyframe it there, add a single keyframe. And then in the middle at 120, we'll move this guy up to its maximum, and we'll add a keyframe there as well. And now if we run the cycle, we'll get a full cycle of the landing gear going up and down. I'll go all the way up, and then it'll come back down again. All right. So, obviously the advantage of doing this is, like I said, you can then add as many keyframes as needed for this throughout your animation, and it makes it very easy to animate the rest of what's going on here. So let's go back to the beginning here. And just some cleanup stuff if you want. We don't need to see all of these bones, so I can select on the bones. If we go down to here, I can select on, I guess we need the root, would be nice. I'm going to shift select all the other bones, and I'm going to hit M, and I'm going to move them to a different layer. That way when we're looking at the animation, we don't see all the other bones. They're just down here on this other layer. You can still see them if you click here, but they're kind of out of the way. It makes things a little nicer. Now we can do some cleanup. We don't need this circle anymore, so I can delete that circle. And if I go forward in my animation, we can see that these empties here were never used for anything. So I can delete them safely, not have to worry about them, and then we're all cleaned up. And I think that should be about it. Hopefully that was helpful. Certainly kind of fun to watch your work move around and work like this. So if you have questions, leave them down there. I will try to answer them. And if you want to follow this, there's a work in progress over at Blender Artists where I'm talking about the entire F101 Voodoo project that I'm making. All right, so I hope to see you in another video. Thanks for watching.